Welcome back, fellow time travelers. Today, we'll be looking at this broken mystery system that came up on Facebook for parts. I don't know anything about its specs, other than it has a 64-bit Athlon processor, at least according to the stickers. Now, this machine may look odd by today's standards, but the early 2000s were full of shiny cases with unique acrylic sides. Honestly, this thing gives me a bit of a Borg feeling. It might be cool to customize it with a Star Trek themed computer. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Looking up the board online, I see that it's based around AMD's most forgotten CPU type, Socket 754. The very first generation of consumer 64-bit AMD processors came out on it, but it was quickly replaced only a few years later by Socket 939. After giving it a once-over for blown caps, I tried to start it up for the first time. And, unsurprisingly, it didn't post. But with a machine that's been sitting idle for so long, my first step is always to reseat the components, starting with the RAM. And, sure enough, that's all it took to get it up and running again. Looks like we have an AMD 3200 Plus with 1GB of RAM. For graphics, it's running the GeForce FX 5700LE GPU. Now, this graphics card is pretty middle tier for the time, so it'll be interesting to see how capable it is. It's always interesting to open up a machine that's been sitting around for so long, kind of like a digital time capsule. And, while I won't be going through the personal files of the previous owner, I do get a laugh every time I find LimeWire running on an old machine. I did take a peek in the MP3 folder, which shows that the last file was downloaded around April of 2010, and the oldest file I could find was from early 2004, which makes sense since the Athlon 64 launched in late 2003. Unfortunately, another issue soon popped up. The original system drive, a 15GB Maxter, died shortly after the first boot, so I dug up a newer 200GB drive and reinstalled Windows XP. From there, I have plans for this machine, but first, let's see what it's capable of. First up is Need for Speed Underground 2. After turning all the graphics down to minimum and lowering the resolution, it was perfectly playable, although nothing to write home about. Next, while newer versions of Grand Theft Auto are off the table, Grand Theft Auto 3 ran quite well, although I did have occasional texture issues. I also wanted to try a slightly newer game, Star Trek Legacy, from all the way back in 2006. Unfortunately, it was single-digit frame rate performance at best and completely unplayable. From there, I thought it'd be interesting to see how far we could push this old architecture. But first, it was time to give it a thorough dusting and get rid of as much of the grime as we can. Then for upgrades, we'll be going with 3GB of DDR memory running at 400MHz, as well as this ATI Radeon 4600 GPU, one of the fastest AGP graphics cards ever released, even requiring its own additional power in addition to the AGP bus. Now, before we get back to gaming performance, I thought I'd see how close to a modern operating system we can get. I started off with Windows 7 64-bit, which installed okay, but wouldn't install the GPU drivers, complaining that the OS wasn't supported. From there, it was time to try Windows 10 64-bit, but unfortunately, the processor lacked some of the required tech to install it. Regrouping, I went to Windows 10 32-bit, which was much happier to install. From here, we ran into more issues, with the GPU not being supported by the OS, and the CPU often remaining pretty close to pinned even when idle. Not ideal. I also tried considering Windows Vista, but at this point, I didn't want to. So I went back to XP and loaded up the same games from before. What was originally barely a slideshow with Star Trek Legacy now runs at the full 60 frames per second most of the time, and stayed smooth throughout. You couldn't ask for much better results than that. Need for Speed Underground 2 doubles its frame rates with the newer GPU and added RAM at the same settings, and even runs playable with the graphics and resolution turned way up, making it a whole lot prettier. Grand Theft Auto 3 still had some texture issues, which are likely fixable with patching. But overall, performance was noticeably better, staying well into the triple digits. Doom 3 didn't put up any remarkable frame rates, but it was perfectly playable and stayed between 30 and 60 frames per second most of the time. Star Trek Elite Force 2 ended up being a bit of a troublemaker for this build. While performance was decent enough, there was random heavy stuttering that definitely took away from the experience. This was likely some sort of driver issue, but I hadn't pinned it down at the time that I finished filming. And just for fun, I booted MS-DOS off of a USB stick and gave Commander Keen a try. Since it only makes use of the PC speaker, it ran perfectly. Overall, it was great to be able to look back at this often forgotten processor that was AMD's first step into home 64-bit computing. While it's unfortunate that it wasn't able to perform well enough to be used for modern tasks, it's still great to take a look back at how things were and revisit some old favorites. But where do we go from here? Is this a good candidate for a custom-themed build? Let me know in the comments below. Hey, thanks so much for watching. And thanks to my awesome Patreon supporters for making videos like this possible. That's it for this one, but I'll see you again soon.